Speaker is Mr. Pokorny from DG Employment, Head of Unit. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the Petitions Committee for organising this very important hearing, which, as was said right at the start, comes at an extremely opportune moment, only a couple of days after the social pillar was proclaimed in Gothenburg. And one of the main objectives of that initiative is, of course, to reduce the precariousness of workers across the European Union and to improve the relevance and the effectiveness of their rights. And in my short intervention, I'd like to just focus on the two main approaches that, from my part of the Commission, we are following to address this growing problem. One is the way that the existing directives are applied, and we've heard a lot in the last session about the fixed-term work directive in particular, and then the legislative follow-up to the social pillar announcement, in particular the revision of the written statement directive, which has also been mentioned already. The directive, there are three directives targeting precarious work, on fixed-term work, on part-time work, and on temporary agency work. They are all based either directly or indirectly on social partner agreements or social partner consultation, and that's important to understand that they represent, the rights that they contain represent a balance between improving the protection of the workers concerned and supporting the positive role that flexibility can play on the labour market in creating jobs. So they are, at their essence, compromises. All three directives have the principle of equal treatment at their core, and this is a powerful principle that has led to judgments of the Court of Justice condemning differences in the treatment of particularly fixed-term and permanent work in relation to employment conditions. This is set out in the directive, and this includes issues such as occupational pensions, length of service allowances, level of pay, redundancy policy, also promotion opportunities or the right to participate in a teaching evaluation plan. And there's also the issue of the compensation that has to be paid to workers on the termination of a fixed-term contract. There are also elements that fall outside the definition of employment conditions, notably the payments forming part of a state social security scheme, such as retirement pensions provided by such schemes. And then the second provision that we need to look at in the fixed-term directive is on preventing abuse of successive fixed-term contracts, where if there are not equivalent national measures, the renewal of fixed-term contracts has to be justified by objective reasons, or there has to be a maximum total duration of the contracts, or a maximum number of renewals. And the challenges that we see looking at the way that these directives are applied and the way that the court has ruled on them, first of all, who is covered? What's the personal scope? Who is a worker? And that we've heard many times today already, and this is becoming an increasingly challenging issue to do with the boundary between self-employed and worker status, the status of people working for platforms, for instance. There was an important judgment last November on the temporary agency directive, Roland Clinic, finding that member states may not define workers so restrictively as to deprive that directive of its effectiveness, even though the directive itself refers to national definitions. And this is relevant for the second last speaker, there's a case coming now before the court where the question of the status of honorary judges in Italy is also being raised and is being referred to the court. So there we will have a ruling on whether they come within the scope of this directive. The second is who is a comparable worker for the prevention of discrimination. Sometimes it's difficult to define who that comparator should be. Sometimes the discrimination is alleged between two different types of fixed-term contract. In that case, the scope of the directive is outside the scope of the directive. What are the objective grounds or the reasons that could justify different employment conditions or successive fixed-term contracts? The Court has established some very important principles that we then see reflected in many of the petitions coming to this committee, that the differences of treatment may not be based on purely formal considerations, such as the fact that the contract said it was fixed-term, or that fixed-term employment should not be used to meet needs that are, in fact, permanent. And I'm sure that these principles will continue to be behind petitions coming here. And then the final issue on what sort of redress is available for workers who have suffered discrimination or who have suffered abuse of successive fixed-term contracts. It's clear that they don't have an automatic right to a full-time contract. What compensation is appropriate in such circumstances is a question that's currently coming in several cases before the court. And we see that there are many petitions, particularly from Spain and Italy, as we've seen today, before this committee. We are continuing to examine the two on the fast food sector in the UK and in Belgium. We have made contact with the member states and will reply again to the committee with an update of our initial response, having analysed the responses that we got. The Italian cases which were presented here, we are in the process of analysing a new legislative decree adopted by the Italian state in the summer, and we'll respond substantively to the committee once we have done so, also decide whether that provides basis for pursuing an infringement or not. We're also waiting a very important judgment of the European Court in the case of Santoro, which will establish the principle of appropriate compensation when this is not transferred to a permanent contract. On the social pillar, briefly, we are legislating. Well, we are consulting social partners, and following that consultation, the option will be open either for the social partners to establish an agreement or for the Commission to legislate. And in particular, in the case of the Written Statement Directive, the question is how this should cover some of the forms of work which are currently falling outside scope, and we estimate there are 2 to 3 million workers across the EU, domestic workers, intermittent workers, zero-hours contractors, whose status is not yet clear. So how do we clarify that status? Should we set criteria in the directive to do so? That's one of the questions the Commission has put to the social partners. And also a very important issue, apart from updating the information that they should receive, what should be the minimum rights that would reduce the degree of precariousness? And we've heard a very eloquent description of the sorts of practices which people are subjected to reduce the degree of precariousness while preserving the right amount of flexibility on the labour market. So the Commission is working on that proposal, is in discussion with the social partners, and we expect to come forward with a legislative proposal around the end of this year. And now I'll give the floor to my colleagues from our Human Resources DG.
Yeah, so